Well, today's classes are going to take us from Egypt to Indonesia, and we're going to go back in time from about 1370 BC to 2 million years, so quite a contrast in classes today. We start off with the horizon of the sun, the story of the discovery of the city of Amarna, the lost city of Akhenaten. You'll remember, I hope, that when Napoleon invaded Egypt, he took with him the savants, and the savants spent the years 1788 to 1801 travelling along the Nile to record everything they could see. Making their way from Cairo up here, they recorded the sites at Giza and Saqqara. Then they were off on their way to Luxor, Thebes, where they found things like the old Memnon, the young Memnon. About halfway on that journey, they came to a place called Amarna. This map is wrong. It says El Amarna. The place was never known as El Amarna. It is Amarna. What they saw when they got to Amarna was basically on the east side of the River Nile, a large area where there had been mud brick buildings with a series of cliffs on the east side, but they could see that carved into the face of the cliffs were a series of statues, and these statues had hieroglyphs with them. So they decided to make their way over to the statues, and they recorded them. This is one of the drawings made by the savants. They could see that the statues had been damaged to a certain extent, and also some of the hieroglyphs had been scrubbed out, as it were. You can see this better in the photograph here, to a certain extent, the way the statues and the inscriptions survive today. But black and white photography always shows up details a lot better than colour photography. And you can see how the heads of the statues have been taken off, and you can see how there's big holes in the hieroglyphic inscriptions there. Well, the savants then looked around Amarna itself. All they could see was a large area, basically 6 kilometres long, 1 kilometre wide at the widest. There was no evidence of any stone buildings, no evidence of stone temples, the sort of things that they were really interested in. So they went down and had a look around the site, and sure enough, it was just basically pretty empty. But they could see the remains of several buildings made of mud brick. What they eventually decided was that this must be some kind of very large workman's village, obviously connected to the pharaohs. They could see that the mud brick buildings could be divided into 3 main groups: a north group, a central group, and a southern group. But there were no remains of stone building. They were interested in stone buildings, statues, inscriptions, that sort of thing. So basically, they really forgot about the site. It wasn't until Champollion comes along to decipher hieroglyphics, and then the inscriptions at Amarna can be read. The inscriptions revealed a very surprising piece of information. All of the inscriptions contain the same phrase saying that these statues carved into rock mark the limits of a city known as Where Nesutum Akhenaten, the horizon of the Artem. Well, a few surviving sources indicated that this must be a city, it was the remains of a city established about 1350 by a pharaoh known as Akhenaten. He was a pharaoh who was very mysterious at this time. His name was missing from all the king's list. And when people started to look for more evidence of Akhenaten, what they discovered was that his name had been deliberately removed from many inscriptions, including the ones at Amarna. This was obviously a pharaoh who the Egyptians did not want to remember. That's why his name was removed. This was obviously a pharaoh whose memory had completely gone, except for a few surviving records which indicated who he was. He had been born with the name Amenhotep. He was the Amenhotep IV, the son of Amenhotep III. Amenhotep means Amun, the great god Amun is pleased by me. But the evidence indicates that shortly after becoming pharaoh, he becomes Akhenaten, the real spirit of the god Artem. The god Aten is one version of the sun god. Amun-Ra is part of the sun god. Aten is another version of the same sun god. Amenhotep and his family had ruled Egypt from Karnak. That was well known. All of his predecessors, his father and all his family before him, were buried at Karnak. But for some reason or other, the evidence made it quite clear, Akhenaten had moved the capital from Karnak to this new city, the horizon of the Aten. Well, people began to explore more and more around Amarna to try and find out more about Akhenaten. And in several of the tombs there, in this particular case, the tomb of a royal official called Ai, they found inscriptions that helped explain what had happened in the past. Basically, it turned out that Amenhotep IV, as he then was, had decided to use his authority to introduce a new religion to the whole of Egypt. This is why he took the name Akhenaten. The traditional religion of Egypt, established for more than 2,000 years, concentrated on the worship of the supreme god, Amun-Ra, but a whole host of other gods. We got Thoth and we got Mer there as well. I mean, there were hundreds of gods connected to the Egyptian religion. What Amenhotep IV had decided to do, this is why he changed his name to Akhenaten, is to introduce an entirely new religion. A new religion that, in a way, could be called monotheistic. A belief in one God. Monotheistic, a belief in one God. Polytheistic, belief in several gods. The evidence indicated that this god was the Aten, the solar disk, and all around Amarna were the remains of carvings showing Akhenaten with his favourite wife, one of several wives, a lady called Nefertiti, worshipping the Aten there. Well, even though very little was known about Akhenaten, and this is quite a surprising discovery, not many people became that interested in Amarna. There were no remains of stone temples, no evidence of any inscriptions apart from the ones on the cliffs. It didn't look like you would find very much at the site of Amarna. So basically, archaeologists just ignored the site. But this all changed after the year 1890. In the year 1890, Wallace Budge, the Egyptologist at the British Museum in London, received a parcel of clay tablets. They had been bought by one of his agents in Egypt and sent to the British Museum. When he started looking at these clay tablets, he realized to his surprise that they were written in Akkadian, cuneiform Akkadian. Well, this started bells ringing. In Egypt, everybody wrote in hieroglyphics or demotic on papyrus. What is this large collection of clay tablets with cuneiform inscriptions in Akkadian doing at Amarna? So he started to read them and soon recognized the name of Akhenaten on one of them. This excited him even more. He began to read the other tablets which had arrived at the British Museum, and this is a selection of them on display at the British Museum now. And he realized that all the ones that had gone to the British Museum were official copies of diplomatic correspondence between different rulers in the Middle East and the pharaoh Akhenaten. As all the tablets were of the same type, they had to come from what must be a royal library, a royal archive of some sort. And so the hunt now started on where did these tablets come from. Well, the dealer established that they had come from Amarna. Research at Amarna discovered that they had actually been found in 1887 when a local woman was digging into the site. She was digging for what was known as sabak. Sabak is the remains of mud brick buildings. Well, mud brick is made using dried straw and other organic material. And when mud brick decays, it makes an excellent fertilizer. She'd been digging into the ruins of one of the mud brick buildings, just like we see here, to get destroyed mud brick for sabak, and she'd found a pile of what she thought were bricks. They had strange markings on them. She didn't know what they were, started to break them up. And just then, fortunately for us, a local teacher came by, and he realized that this was an ancient form of writing. Well, he knew he could make money by selling antiquities. He didn't know what they were. So he arranged for them to be sold in Cairo, and eventually, of course, they started to make their way to other places. The local teacher bought something like 300 tablets altogether, and very quickly, all the major museums in Europe were beginning to buy these things, or their agents were buying them. This is how some of the tablets reached Budge and the British Museum. Well, Budge, having realised that these tablets must have come from an official royal collection of some kind, immediately started to arrange for the site to be excavated. And we like to think of Sir William Flinders Petrie as an English archaeologist. He was actually born in Australia, but spent all his working life in England. And he was sent out to Armagh to try and discover what else there was there. Flinders Petrie got to Armagh in 1891. He started working there, finished his work in 1892. He excavated in the central part of the city and quickly discovered that there had been stone temples there, but the stone temples had been completely demolished. All that was left were the foundations in the ground, and the foundations represented a different type of temple plan than was normally found in Egypt. He then started excavating in the other parts of the city and quickly found this: examples of Mycenaean pottery. The type of pottery he knew Schliemann had found at Mycenae, and in this way, because the city of Akhenaten could be dated to about 1300 BC, this gave a date to the Mycenaean civilization. It's what we call cross-dating, dating something in one country from what is found in another country. They found these excellent examples of Mycenaean pottery, which indicated that the city of Akhenaten had extensive trade contacts. Finally, Petrie started working on one of the mud brick buildings, and he found there a total of 21 clay tablets, and some of them had the remains of Demotic inscriptions on them, ink writing on them. And these said, in Egyptian Demotic, "This is the property of the Bureau of Correspondence, the Office of Correspondence." So he knew that the building he was working in was the place where the tablets had been found in 1887. This is what it looks like now. Not terribly impressive. It has been completely excavated. There's nothing left in that particular site now. Well, by this time, the rest of the tablets that had been found in Armagh in 1887 had all been sold. The majority of them, something like 202, were bought by the Imperial Museum in Berlin, now the Berlin Staatliche Museum, and here you see one of the examples that they have there, 202 there. Of the other tablets, it was discovered that something like 49 had gone to the National Museum of Egypt, 7 went to the Louvre in Paris, 3 to the Pushkin Museum in Moscow, 1 to the Oriental Institute in Chicago, and a few to private collectors. Well, these tablets are in Akkadian, and so it was obviously a chance for somebody to read all these tablets. Akkadian had been deciphered by Sir Henry Rawlinson about the time that Layard was excavating at Nineveh. And it was a Danish-born linguist, Jürgen Alexander Knudsen, working in Berlin, started work on them. Professor of Semitic languages at the University of Oslo, in Norway. He translated all of the 380 Amarna tablets that he could find, using copies of some. There were only 2 which were not in Akkadian. These remained a puzzle until 1917. These tablets used Akkadian cuneiform symbols, but for a language that clearly wasn't Akkadian. What language was it? Hittite. this leads on to the discovery of the Hittites. Anyway, Knudsen didn't know what they were at the time. Knudsen published his results in 2 volumes, the Armano tablets, 1905 and 1915. And this revealed that most of the Armano letters, about 300 or so, were actually copies of diplomatic correspondence between the pharaohs Amenhotep III and Akhenaten. So very much part of the royal letter collection. Well, this correspondence was with rulers from different parts of the Middle East. Knudsen couldn't read Hittite. He didn't know that the 2 tablets he couldn't read were Hittite, but obviously this is correspondence from the land of the Hatti. There were correspondence from rulers of the Mitanni, the rulers of Umara, the ruler of Al-Ashiyah, the place that we call today Cyprus. These tablets gave the most amazing amount of information about diplomatic contacts and what went on in the Middle East about 1350. It's like opening somebody's diary, finding out the troubles of a particular ruler at that particular time. They help explain trade contacts in this period. The only evidence for that is really in the form of pottery. They help explain the chronology. We can pin down the names of rulers in other places because they wrote letters to Akhenaten or to Amenhotep III. Well, what do these letters reveal? Well, just a selection. Let's look at tablet 252. It's basically a complaint written by one of the rulers of the area called Canaan. And it goes on and on and on about his enemies and how they captured a city of Shechem. At the end of it, he says, these people are called the Apuru. Now, some scholars, not all, believe that Apuru is a transcription, a different version of the Akkadian word Ibrim, which means the people of Abraham, therefore the Hebrews. And so this tablet may be the earliest reference we have in this form to the Israelites. Maybe it may not be. Not everybody agrees on the interpretation of this particular tablet. Apiru, Ibrim could be the same, but no certainty. Shechem is within what is now the occupied West Bank, so the topography ties up as well. Let's look at another one, the one we saw earlier, letter number 5. This is from Tushratta, great king of Mitanni, to Amenhotep III, but kept in the royal archives. This is an astounding piece of information. It's basically a letter about some gifts he's sent, but it begins, Tushratta, great king of Mitanni, your father-in-law. This is the only evidence we have that Amenhotep III was married to a daughter of the king of the Mitanni. Well, marriages between royal families were normally done to make certain peace coexisted. The Mitanni were the great enemies of the Hittites. Amenhotep III and Akhenaten are also great friends of the Hittites. So you can see how they're playing the political sides. A royal marriage to secure a connection with the Mitanni, but at the same time, the rulers of Egypt are writing to the Hittites to promise their daughters and sons in marriage as well. A piece of information, historical information that is not recorded anywhere else. We have a whole series of wonderful letters. I don't have an example to show you, but the same sort of thing, from the ruler of a place called Amuru, roughly modern Lebanon, about the problems he was having with the ruler of the next door city, Byblos, which is in modern Lebanon. There are no less than 58 letters from the ruler of Amuru complaining about his next door neighbor, attacking his crops, stealing his sheep, and there are no less than 20 letters from the ruler of Byblos complaining about the same thing. Well, this is everyday life in a sense, but these people are writing to the pharaoh in Egypt because they see him as the person who can solve this particular problem. One of the more mysterious letters in many ways, and the answer to this was not revealed until 1917 or later, was letter number 161 from another ruler of Amaru, to Akhenaten. O Lord, do not listen to the enemies who slander me before you, the king. This is actually a letter about how a messenger from the Hittites has been delayed on his journey from Anatolia to Egypt. Everybody is blaming it on Azuru. But Azuru is saying, it's not me, don't listen to anybody else, I wasn't responsible. This particular letter ties in with the discoveries that were made at Boazkoi, Hattusha, discoveries which were made much earlier, but letters in Hittite that were only read after 1917. And we see the Hittite version of the correspondence. I have sent you a messenger. Why was he delayed? So we see all these little interlinking things there. Then we come to one of the more important letters in many ways, letter number 34. We don't know if it was to Amenhotep III or to Akhenaten, but it's from the king of Alashia, the island of Cyprus. And it's a whole letter about gifts that are being sent to the Pharaoh of Egypt. It talks about this, that, and the other, but most importantly, it talks about copper. Cyprus, the copper island. Cyprus was the source of probably 90% of the copper in this particular period, in the late Bronze Age. And you can see here that the king of Alashia is sending this copper as a gift to the ruler of Egypt to keep his friendship. In Egypt, of course, it gets transformed into bronze tools and bronze weapons. Well, while Knudsen is busy working on these tablets, beginning to publish in them, a major discovery is made by the French archaeologist Georges Legrand. He's standing over there, typical solar hat to protect you against the sun, in the ruins of one of the temples in Karnak. He discovered there an inscription which really gave some of the most important evidence about the reign of Akhenaten. We know this as the restoration stela. It was set up by one of Akhenaten's successors, a man called Tutankhamun. What the restoration stela points out to us, which nobody had known before, was that Akhenaten's new religion, after being introduced, had basically brought calamity to the people of Egypt. The temples and the estates of the gods and the goddesses have fallen to ruin. The shrines have fallen down. Everything's a pile of rubble. The temples look as if they never existed at all. The temples have become footpaths. The world was in chaos, and the gods turned their backs on this land. And it concludes by saying, after becoming king, His Majesty Tutankhamun considered in his heart and looked for something to make the life of the Egyptian people better for Amun. The gods and goddesses rejoice because Amun has been restored as the chief god. The god Aten is now out of the way. His Majesty has restored Egypt. Well, this was really quite an important discovery because it helped fill in the picture. It's a remarkable survival. And I'll explain why, because you see these cut marks down here. These were made probably in the Byzantine period, possibly in the medieval period, by people who were going to break the stone in half and use it for a building. The method is to make a hole like this. Each hole is filled with a piece of wood. You soak the wood expands, it cracks the stone in half. And if that job had been completed, this would not have survived. It would have been a building stone, and nobody ever would have got this amazing piece of information. Well, the publication of the Amarna letters, the discovery of the restoration stela, encouraged new interest, of course, in Amarna. And in 1907, the German Deutsche Orientalgesellschaft sent out Ludwig Burckhardt to start working there. Burckhardt arrives knowing from Flinders Petrie's work that there really isn't anything left of the temples. But Burckhardt is not interested in temples. What Burckhardt realizes is that Amarna is an Egyptian town, city, that was only occupied for a very short period of time while Akhenaten was alive. This was a unique chance, and I used the word unique properly, the single chance, to recover evidence for what life was like in an Egyptian city in ancient Egypt. All the other places have been built on Karnak, Luxor, Memphis. You can't find anything there, but at Amarna you could. So he started working in both the north and the south city at Amarna, and this is a contemporary photograph showing the state of the remains at that particular time. What he discovered from his excavations was that, sure enough, the houses had only been occupied for a very short period of time. There was no real rubbish in them, no dirt in them, anything like that. And that the evidence indicated that people had basically just left the houses, leaving behind what they didn't want. There was nothing of any value in any of the buildings. The mud bricks had fallen in, and so the site got covered with sand. Because the site was only occupied for a very short period of time, he was able to recover evidence that this was a planned city. That the whole city had been divided into roughly square and rectangular areas, and that within these areas there were very large houses in some places, obviously for officials, smaller houses at the back. All the houses share the same basic plan. There's differences from one to another. But what you have is a series of storerooms over here for keeping grain. You've got a courtyard, a small little temple next door. You've got kitchens and servants' areas. You keep the animals out in the backyard. These houses were remarkably decorated. Now, today, of course, all we see are the remains of the mud brick. Any plaster has fallen off, it's completely disintegrated. The columns were probably of wood in this particular case, using a palm tree. But the houses were so neatly laid out that they all had their own toilets. And because of the preservative qualities of the sand, the dry atmosphere, in some places even the wooden door was still left in place there. Well, this was an amazing discovery in itself. We can't be certain that this is typical of an ancient Egyptian city, because Amarna was built for and occupied for a very short period of time. It's very much a royal city. But it does give this wonderful insight into what actually ancient Egyptian houses were like. The most important discovery that Burckhardt made, though, was what turned out to be the combined house and workshop of the royal artist, a man called Thutmose. This is the house of Thutmose. This is the plan of it, and you can see it's broadly the same as all the other houses. But what was really fascinating here was that when Thutmose left the building, he left behind all the works of art that he hadn't finished or he didn't want. And so inside this building, what Burckhardt found was a whole series of rough-out portraits carved into the rock, a portrait of Akhenaten here, for example, a sketch, again on limestone in this case, of Akhenaten and probably Nefertiti, we can't be certain. Rough-out sculptures in limestone, perhaps of Nefertiti, well, I'll explain why we think it's Nefertiti in a moment. A wonderful rough-out sketch showing two daughters of Akhenaten, recognizable by the shape of their heads. I'll come back to that later. And there are a selection of portraits there. The most amazing discovery, though, was this. It's a piece of limestone that stands that high, buried in one corner of the workshop. All the paint's surviving excellently well. Only one of the eyes was painted. One of the ears had been damaged. It could be recognized as a portrait bust of Nefertiti, and here she is in close-up, which Burckhardt decided must go to Berlin. And so it was put in a box. Written on the box was limestone head. Remember, as I said before, this, in many countries the antiquities laws at these times were on the basis of half to the excavator, half to the state, or a third to the excavator, third to the landowner, a third to the state. The Egyptian antiquities law was half to the excavator, half to the state. Nobody bothered to check what Burckhardt was shipping out. And so this went to Berlin, and it's been in Berlin ever since, much to the annoyance of the Egyptian authorities, who would like this back, along with the Rosetta Stone and a few other bits and pieces. Well, the most amazing thing, of course, about all this particular sculpture was that it was an entirely different type of sculpture and art from anything that anybody had really seen before. What we see in the portraiture of Akhenaten are very exaggerated figures. So, for example, Akhenaten, we see a very large stomach, feminine type hips, a very long and elongated face. And we see the same type of details in members of his family. Two of Akhenaten's daughters, this is a painting on a tomb wall, elongated heads, rather misshaped bodies. Terribly strange in many ways. This particular style of art had not really been seen anywhere before. After work at Amarna, people started to find examples buried within different temples within Egypt itself, deliberately buried, deliberately defaced. Another interesting feature about this art was the way it showed Akhenaten and Nefertiti in a more human way. Here we see Akhenaten and Nefertiti worshipping the Aten symbol. Here is another representation of them. Compare that with how the pharaoh and his wife were shown in previous times. Amenhotep III, father of Akhenaten, and his wife, sitting there full square like that, not smiling, don't look human. One of their daughters, reduced size at the front, she's not very important. If it was a son, reduced sized at the front. But what you see in the portraiture of Akhenaten and Nefertiti is a human scale to it. Nefertiti is always shown slightly smaller, but not much smaller. The children are shown small because they are small. But you also see amazing things like this. This is a sculpture that shows Akhenaten with one of his daughters, holding his daughter, kissing his daughter. Nefertiti on the other side is holding another daughter who's pointing towards her father. It's human. It's something that never existed in Egyptian art before and never existed in Egyptian art afterwards. This is purely something from the time of Akhenaten. Well, what we still don't know is why Akhenaten was shown in this particular way. Some people have suggested that he might have had some form of bone defect, or perhaps his skull was artificially shaped in this way. We'll see when I do the class on Tutankhamun that there is some evidence that he might have had a bone defect that caused his face to be rather like this. But it's so terribly elongated, nobody can actually come up with any real explanation for an illness or some genetic problem that might have caused his face to have this type of appearance. But what about his protruding stomach? Well, in the modern world, if you see anybody with this type of stomach, a very thin person but very protruding stomach, it's natural to think of malnutrition, a bad diet, something like that. But this is a pharaoh. A pharaoh is the last person to have a bad diet or anything like that. So that explanation doesn't fit. There's also a problem in many ways that what we see in Akhenaten are androgynous features. Not quite male, not quite female. If we look at an early sculpture of Amenhotep, we can see he's got slightly more prominent breasts than what would be normally shown for a pharaoh. When we look at Akhenaten, we've got these very round, very feminine hips. It doesn't look like he has a penis or anything. It looks everything female from there down, but everything male is up from there up. So it's almost as if his sculptures are intended to combine male and female together. Perhaps part of this monotheistic religion idea. He is the mother and the father of the Egyptian people. Really, people don't know at all why this style of art was adopted. On the other hand, we or rather connected to this, we don't know why he chose this particular religion, this monotheistic religion. We don't know why he rejected the old gods. We know he made the decision by rough chronology, 1347. There are problems with dating the Egyptian rulers, and I'll explain about that in another class. 1347 was the same year he built his city, the Horizon of the Sun. Well, the Horizon of the Sun, Amarna, is exactly halfway between the old capital of Egypt, Memphis, and the later capital of Egypt, Karnak. So that's a deliberate decision in that particular case. Although an inscription at Amarna explains why it was chosen, that the spirit of Aten led him to that site and he saw the sunlight flash on that particular site there. We do know that the site at Amarna was defined by a series of 11 boundary markers. We can still see the 9 carved into the cliffs, and that work started on building this city immediately. It was built very quickly. The city probably had a population of about 30,000 people. It was provided with temples of a completely different type for the new religion of the Aten. For the religion of the Aten, the emphasis was on seeing the sun, so the temples had a big courtyard in front of them where the people could gather. Once a sufficient number of new houses had been built, then members of Akhenaten's family, Akhenaten himself, started to build their tombs around the site. The evidence also indicates that Akhenaten died probably in about 1332, and that Egypt was briefly ruled by a man called Smenkhara. We don't quite know who Smenkhara is, but again, I'll explain about this when we look at Tutankhamun. Smenkhara quickly disappears and is replaced in the historical record by a previously unheard of 9-year-old boy whose birth name was Tutankhaten, the image of Aten, but he changed his name to Tutankhamun. Well, this of course ties up with the restoration stela. What we can see is Tutankhaten must be somehow related to Akhenaten, the similarity of the name, but after he becomes ruler at the age of 9, within 2 or 3 years, he changes his name to Tutankhamun, and the old religions are restored. Quite what happened, we don't exactly know. It could be that the priest of the old religions, powerful enough, political enough, they can influence a 9-year-old boy very easily. They encourage him to bring back the old religion. We also find that at this time, or later, this is when all the images and the statues of Akhenaten are defaced. His name is crossed out. Where's his name gone? His name is there, it's been crossed out. His face has been crossed out on that particular wall painting. Here we have another wall painting from Amarna. Akhenaten's body has been completely removed, and the Aten symbol as well. And the cartouches with his name in have also been defaced as well. We even find statues of Nefertiti we can identify from the cartouches. She's had her head, her body, and her breast knocked off. Well, this, of course, all ties in with what the restoration stela says, that the new religion is restored. But what caused the new religion to be restored? Was it simply a matter of politics, old priest, or was it something else? This is where the letters from Hattusha come in. Because we learn from the letters found at Hattusha, not translated till after 1917, that round about the time Akhenaten was alive, there was a pandemic, an illness that affected people throughout the Middle East. Records in Egypt refer to this as well. We don't know what time of illness it was. We do know it killed the ruler of the Hittites. It was taken to the Hittite kingdom by Egyptian prisoners of war, captured in a battle shortly after Akhenaten died. Well, the most likely type of illness to have this type of effect at this period would be some form of influenza. swine flu, pig flu, bird flu, something like that. These are illnesses that develop in unsanitary living conditions. A lot of the time they develop in China and that sort of area, where people literally live with pigs and birds and waterfowls and chickens and things like that. And as you almost certainly will know, of course, the pig flu virus, the bird flu virus, the human flu virus are separate things, but they can combine when you've got all those three things together to end up with a pandemic. We know that at Amarna, the model houses had compounds, courtyards, in which pigs and birds were kept. It's possible that a pandemic started in Egypt, but we can certainly see how something like a pandemic, a major illness affecting Egypt, the whole of the Middle East, would cause panic amongst people who believed that now the old gods had been got rid of, the old gods were getting their revenge. We must go back to the old gods. Only by going back to the old gods can we be saved. Either way, what clearly happens is soon after Akhenaten's death, the city he founded, the horizon of the sun, was deserted, covered by sand. The temples were completely demolished and the stone taken away for use somewhere else. All trace of Akhenaten and his wife, Nefertiti, and his other wives was completely removed. Inscriptions were torn down. One of his temples in Karnak was completely demolished, and the remains used to build another temple, but with the hieroglyphs facing inwards so that nobody could see the name of Akhenaten. It's fortunate in many ways that Akhenaten died when he did, and of this pandemic, and that the old religions were returned, or were brought back. Because this meant that the city, the horizon of the sun, was deserted. This meant that we could actually see what an Egyptian city looked like. It wasn't excavated because there were no temples there, no inscriptions, no statues. And the whole site basically remained a secret until one little old lady decided to go digging for sabak. And one little teacher saw something that he realized he could sell. And eventually the whole secret came out. Okay, we'll finish on that one. How did I do for time this time?